But yeah, welcome back, guys, to episode 5 of Decommissioned. Thank you for joining again. Yeah, I wanted to get back together and talk about interoperability and partner onboarding again, um, and just get more into the weeds of all of it, and kind of understand what it might look like for some people right now, but what it could look like, as well as like real world scenarios of how connectivity is. I mean, we've got Hammer House, Wes Craven stories of horror with regards to onboarding experiences, right? Um, and how, some people, are kind of strong armed commercially into like backing out of uh, changing their vendor because of the cost attached to connecting to partners, right? That use a particular system, for example. Um, so I think, you guys are all completely different vendors, right? And I think it's a good forum for us to demonstrate what really a network is, what interoperability really truly means. And it doesn't come from one vendor corner, it comes from a whole community of vendors, right? So, so I wanted us to get a little bit deeper into that area and that topic. I think Scott as well might have something to add to that, especially from an archetypal perspective. But yeah, I wanted us to cover like things like EPCIS and the significance of that and examples of adulteration, right? That can happen or be signaled when you're onboarding a partner, right? Um, the costs of onboarding, the unnecessary cost, the huge disparity between what should be digital and akin to the internet and what is actually a digital skeuomorph of an ancient pre-war telephone network, right? So, I mean, Scott, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I'm quite cynical on this topic.
Yeah, I think maybe a good place to start is a little bit of history just to give context, because I think that can also then allow us to probably pull in from the various experiences we might have, individually, each of us might have had from early on. I think certainly speaking from very much a US, I mean, you could say DSCSA, but I think when we get into the topic of interoperability and partner connections. We even have to go back before DSCSA was even a thing, right? Because it was really the e-pedigree laws in the US that predated DSCSA, but still forced a lot of the same kind of needs and concepts from a partner onboarding standpoint. I think the interesting kind of dynamic in the US, right, is the concept of connectivity, at least in terms of between trading partners, really was not much of a focus or priority in the early days because that wasn't how the regulations were being phased out, right? I mean, the first obviously milestones of DSCSA was you had to get a physical barcode on the packs and you had to, make sure that the data encoded in those barcodes was correct. And really the first kind of notion of making connections, if you will, was with packaging operations. And so I think because of that, you had a lot of efforts that were put into, the first sort of, again, we now call it partner onboarding or establishing connections, was basically just a manufacturer needing to connect to their packaging operations, whether that's internal sites or CMOs. So, and because I think that was always seen as within the four walls of the manufacturer, whether truly or virtually, there was this mindset, I think, right, that the vendors, the L4, L5 vendors just said, okay, well, I'm going to figure out a way to establish a connection to the appropriate serialization systems that are operating at the packaging sites. And that was essentially the start of what I think we've now seen kind of spider across the whole industry, again, at least in the US, where it's very much just this collection of of point-to-point connections, right? Because there wasn't really the focus or priority from a industry standpoint way back then to say, hold on, let's maybe take a step back and really try to think about what would be the best way to establish all these connections between all these different entities. So you had sort of that precedent set very, very early on that these were going to be point to point connections. And then again, I think we've now seen the 10, 15, whatever it is, plus years of sort of just that concept evolving kind of has gotten us largely to where we are today across the industry. And also then I think the reason why there's so much opportunity to now go back and sort of rethink this whole concept of interoperability.
Well, and the problem maybe to add to that is also, and that is especially in the US, that we see with a lot of systems that the customers themselves cannot actually manage these connections. So they are depending on the vendor. The vendor is kind of hiding how the connection works in the backend. And a lot of times what we also see is that and we see that at the moment, especially in the US, where if a vendor is taking the actions, a support call needs to be made to that vendor. You get into a queue, and then it can sometimes take a couple of weeks to a couple of months before they have time to make the connection. And well, the connection to set it up in a modern system shouldn't take then a couple of minutes, or at least something where you click, 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 say, okay, who is the other side? What type of connection do they use? And we can connect. And I think with some providers, we have that flexibility that we can just say to our customers, okay, you just select who you need to connect to, and the connection is there. With other vendors, you can make the connection on our side, and then you need to wait till the vendor has time and the customer has paid the money to set up the connection before the connection is established.
It's a really good point. I think that's a key thing for maybe the audience to take away as maybe a symptom or a sign to look for, right? Is that if you need to depend on your vendor to connect to external partners, for example, or you need to wait to connect to other vendors because, or other partners because their vendor has NSMs. And let's not beat around the bush, right? The nature of an, a redundant resource in the supply chain that only benefits the vendor, right? That's one example that anybody listening to this podcast could say, well, I actually have to engage my vendor to make a connection. And what we're saying is, well, that's a bit historic, right? That shouldn't really be how it is. I mean, all of you guys, provide self-service capability as well. Um, and you all interoperate and connect with each other. I know this because I've seen your system. So I know I can log into like Mobilitas and I could see Altius Hub as a connector, right? And I could just choose that. Yeah, I don't have to ring up Mark or wait for somebody else or consult with a third party to enable that connection, right? What what other signs could customers look for to see that actually they've got an inefficient vendor connection infrastructure?
If I could add to Mark's point, Justin, and continuing, and I'll try to answer the question that you just posed, right? The signs of uh, an inefficient vendor connection and network. Um, Two things are clearly going wrong. One thing that the network configuration is hidden behind a paywall or at a backend. And second, the aspect that to maintain those configuration, there needs to be a team of individual who will eventually give you a scope of work basis which a charge will be given to the customer. The biggest side effect that has happened because of these two structures is when I'm going to the customer and asking their serialization team, right? Uh, right? You can manage your network, you can manage your downstream partners, you can manage the type of data or files or shipment to be exchanged with them. And Altius Hub is there for you, right? Us being a software, us being an AI-powered software, our job is to just give you the product on a subscription, and that's it. The vendors, sorry, the customers are spooked. Why? Because now they just don't know how to do it. They have become so dependent on these external consultants that they are, they're kind of spooked in the sense that they're not even willing to take that accountability on themselves, however easy it might be. It's a very easy thing in today's day and age. Configuring a network with maybe 100 downstream partners. You can ask Dan what they have done in TrustMed, right? Configuring those 100 downstream partners and enabling that data action is as seamless as setting up your desktop. That's it. Once you set it up, you can, just go with the flow. It's supposed to be that, but the existing legacy vendors have complicated it so much that the customers are now scratching their heads thinking, is this even possible? Right? Is this should this even happen? Because these are compliances. What if something doesn't work? The question is not even about what if. The question is, have you tried it? Right? Have you tried removing your dependency on a cost center that adds zero value to you? Have you tried moving your dependency from an expertise that just doesn't add any, improvement in your gross margin? Have you tried training yourself on a product as capable as, Moviltas, TrustMed, or Altius Hub, where, once you're trained on that product, you can manage your show. That's it. We will never come to you. God forbid, we may only come to you when things do go south. And of course, we'll, with all our SLA commitments, we'll fix it right away. And that's all it's supposed to happen, right? And the cracks are coming up. The Indian side of things, the manufacturers who are manufacturing to and supplying to hundreds of distributors and MAHs in the US, in Europe, it's like, how should I explain it? I don't know if you have seen that image of an Indian transformer where so many wires just come in, right? And you just don't know which wire goes to which end. And it's just that. It's just a matter of time the transformer will just explode, right? At scale. Because at scale, being so dependent on such architecture of product is extremely risky. They have to learn to get that control back to themselves, and that's where we are striving to change this paradigm.
It was an
So
interesting
does the
thinking
issue
both of
exist
those.
with the vendor, or sorry, with the vendor or the consultants or both for the customer? Would you say, Abraham?
Sorry, I didn't get you, Jerome. Can you repeat that?
Sorry. So does the issue, do you see the issues lying with the consultants, with the vendor, or with the customer?
It's everywhere. In fact,
It's
that's
ever, is it because the process of change is not clear?
no, absolutely. The question is bang on because now there are three problems that have emerged. The problem of the vendor who's committing that everything your network data exchange
Okay.
can be taken care of. By who? By a service model. Then the vendors' capability. The companies are not investing anymore in their serialization supply chain teams wherein they're supposed to do that, right? When they invest in their own team, bring in and have experts in their team, things can be taken care of. So there's a chain effect in which the issues lies at the vendor, at the service team, and with the customers where, their dependency is way too high on them.
But I think we shouldn't underestimate, because when you talk about serialization teams, you already talk about decent sized companies. Yeah, but we have a lot of companies, especially in the US, and especially with the November deadline ahead of us, where all the small distributors or dispensers, sorry, need to be connected and need to be able to receive EPCIS files. A lot of those companies are very small and they have absolutely no clue how to receive this. I mean, they don't have the IT infrastructure, they don't have the IT knowledge. And especially for those companies, we need to make it very, very simple to do an onboarding. And if you look at the concepts that are available, we are in the cloud. And when we look at the Movilitas cloud, you can have that partner model where you say, okay, I invite you as a partner, like you want to be my friend on Facebook. You just enter an email address of a dispenser. The dispenser receives automatically an email saying, okay, this and this supplier of you wants you to be connected. You press the button to accept it and you are connected. So it doesn't have to take more than literally 5 minutes. And if you don't like that connection anymore, you defriend, you say cancel the connection, and you're gone. The funny thing is, though, that even though those possibilities are there technically, almost nobody's using them because everybody is so used to saying, no, we need to set up point-to-point, we need to have an AS2 connection on both sides. We even sometimes need to discuss, and we talk about CMO MEH connections, about what is the format. We also have some other companies that say we use EPCIS, but it's just a little flavor of ourselves. So it's not completely exactly the same as everybody else is using, but it looks a lot like it. Yeah. And then you have also the situation where companies are using filters to check if the EPCIS file is actually correct. The problem is only that a lot of those systems allow you to set the parameters yourself. So you get funny situations where people don't accept your file, even though it is completely DSCSA compliant. So you're on mute, Justin.
Sorry, some good points. I mean, coming back to all three of you, I mean, certainly there's a triangle, right, of vendors, consultants, customers. You know, sort of hedging on Jerome's question, and it's the customers who are influenced by the vendors and the consultants, right?
Because they don't know. Yeah.
Right. And you know, you were describing this technology, Mark, and the thing is, it's not something that's new. It's here now, right? And Abby, you were saying, look, people should try it. They should have a look. And I think that's the context here, right? Is that in one side of the world, you've got this hugely complicated network for greater good nonsense with, you know, NSMs and service links and God knows what level of unnecessary complexity that's so far from an internet-based or digital-based model. It's boggling how it gets sold to customers, right? And it's a testament to their sales expertise. But then the other side of the world, right? You've got practicality, right? I mean, especially with Dan at Trust and Mark, you at Movilitas, right? You guys have got that network model that it makes it easy for small distributors, small pharmacies to connect at very low cost, you know, not capital costs, right? And obviously they're not aware of that. So there's a network effect that takes place, I think, where someone hears a vendor, or what we see is that a vendor will say, oh, we're using this vendor, and the best way to connect is to use that vendor. But that's where the trap occurs, I think, for the customer, because they're making a decision based on what they think is correct, but they don't fully understand what that implication is to their business operations and the value they get from that investment, right? In terms of the operational function that should just be an exchange of data and events. Yeah, just events, a commissioning event, a packaging event, a shipment event, an aggregation event. It's very straightforward, right? But it's overly complicated. And I think maybe Dan and Mark, you can give some insight into how does your network model contrast, and how, you know, what makes it so close to the internet? Like, you know, if we use the internet, we use HTTP. If we send an email, we use SMTP. If we want to send files. We use SFTP. There are standards. Anyone can build whatever they want. I could build something. Scott could build something. Nikolai could build something. All of us, right? As long as we adhere to those standards, right? There's no NSMs. There's no SOWs to make a connection. You just build you build your business logic and you attach to it. How did you guys approach that model, and what does it mean for the rest of the community in terms of interoperability and connecting with you? What would it mean in terms of what someone's using in terms of a legacy format, 100 connections, to coming over to your world?
You want to go first, then?
Yeah, I'll start. And I mean, I think that there's going to be a lot of similarities because I think, I had the luxury of being, kind of watching Mobilitas Cloud, emerge close to the same time that we came out. And, one of the similarities that I noticed pretty early on was that it was designed intentionally, right? It's designed intentionally to be easy to use and to network efficiently. And so there's been a lot of conversation about point-to-point connections. Um, One of my colleagues just gave a presentation at GS1 about how to handle the scaling of EPCIS connectivity. How do you handle that scaling? And one of the concepts that he talked about was he didn't use point to point. What he used a term called explicit routing. And so Justin, you just mentioned this, or maybe it was Mark. It was Mark who mentioned it, which is if I have an AS2 connection, right, for inbound, then I need to have an AS2 connection on the outbound. That's how a lot of these systems work, right? And so when we think about the internet, right, how would that function in the internet? Is that required? And the answer is no, right? The answer is that I can translate one protocol to another seamlessly. If I'm sending an email from Gmail to Jerome and he's using Outlook, right? It doesn't really matter. The email just gets sent. And so, we refer to that internally as intelligent routing. So I can take the data in, regardless of what type of connectivity is required, and then I can deliver that file to any partner, regardless of what connectivity is required. And what this does is it obviously allows the seamless transmission of data, which is incredibly valuable in an interoperable supply chain. But it also allows for the supply chain to continue to innovate. Somebody had said that, there's a lot of small partners, maybe, even micro partners that don't have the ability to receive data. They don't have a system to receive data. Well, that's changing, right? And there's a lot of technology providers that are emerging because there's a lot of investment that's happening in the pharmaceutical supply chain. And with that emergence, when these companies are developed and the technologies are developed, they're developed on modern standards. So the days of us requiring an explicit routing system to move data are very rapidly deteriorating. And organizations that don't have the ability to fluidly move their data are going to find themselves in a position where they're not able to move it to certain partners. And that will continue to scale out as innovation within this space happens, unless we're starting to use intelligent routing systems like we make available.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that is underutilized in the market is the use of APIs. I mean, because what we see is that companies exchange EPCIS files, so really a file. What we also provide is the possibility to add the content of that file into the body of an API, with the big advantage that when you start using APIs is that you can, first of all, make it easy, because you just need to provide your supplier with some credentials to create a token with an endpoint, and they can do all the work on their own, which is very simple. But secondly, the advantage is also that with an API call, you can immediately give feedback. Like with a file, you dump it, and okay, AS2 gives you at least a message like it is being delivered. But how many calls we get, people say, well, we cannot find the file. And what happens then is that you need to provide the proof that it has been accepted. but then it's lost. I mean, at least you can prove that the problem is not on your side, but what the problem is, where the file ended up with, you have no idea. And with an API call, the nice thing is, I mean, I can send it and I can immediately give feedback about, is it okay, is it not okay? I can even tell what is not okay. So you have a lot more user-friendly way of dealing with an interface.
So there's a lot more feedback and a lot more feedback loop there, is there, Mark?
Excuse me?
So there's a lot more feedback and a lot more feedback loop. Sorry, my volume a bit now.
Yes.
Yeah. So because on the point-to-point connection, one of the issues they had early on with the European system, medicine verification system, is when uploading data into the system and distributing data to different countries, the national systems didn't always respond consistently with the hub. And so you just get lost messages in the system, and it wasn't clear whether the data had been distributed. I'm guessing that you probably get some of the same issues now if you use point-to-point connections. But obviously, as you're saying, with API connections, you should get those feedback loops and the mechanism of transmission, but also the feedback loops and the feedback messages would be much clearer. But of course, if you're a user, if you're a pharmacy and you're making that connection and you're a pharmacist, you're used to dispensing medicines and managing prescriptions, etc. You're not a technology guy. So what happens when you get those messages and what do you do about them? And that's been an issue all the way through. Now, if you're down at the lowest level, the small pharmacist or the small wholesaler, you may not have the skill and capability to deal with those messages coming back. And that is a skills and capabilities issue. And that's something that's been a bit of a problem in Europe over quite a long time.
I think I'd just like to add to say I think this is a where digitization is performed best, right? Because that, you know, as long as you've got a standard, right? So if there's an agreed standard, anyone, it comes back to what I was saying, anyone can build an app to make it easier for the user, right? Everything that we do and all these apps that we use and how they get better and better, and even these AI tools are the result of us building better interfaces, right? That are more suitable. So I think that the problem actually stems from a lack of standards. And if there were those standards, all of those issues would just be gone because the innovation that you would see would filter the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, about what people could and would really use. So I know we've had this discussion as well, Jerome, before, but I think this comes back to where vendors are fundamentally the problem with driving forward suitable technology in terms of what's required from it in these industries.
On top to what you just said, Justin, I would like to add not only one common standard, but the interpretation of this standard. I mean, any software provider company should have one understanding of this standard. It shouldn't have interpretation of the standard, because what we see with onboarding new customer and new connection with our system at the moment is that the other system, a little bit smaller company that providing software, they claim that they use the same standard for EPC communication or API communication. But when we exchange really the messages, we find out that some of the tags in the message itself, it's hard-coded, it's not dynamic, and the message it's not processed correctly. So they claim that they have the standard and they use it, but in the same time we see that it's the way they use it, it's not the correct way. So what we are doing after that, like a vendor here, and someone who is trying to follow standard, maybe some first, of course, common standard for all vendor, and after that, good knowledge, everyone to use this standard.
Yes, and I agree with you. I agree with you, Nicola. It's great to have those standards and to be able to use them. But no, when you look at the I don't know how many software. I think in the USA, correct me, Scott. I think there are about 25 software providers. In Europe, there's 2,500. And the number of software providers is very large. And that means the skill and capabilities of those software providers is very variable. You get some very big software. I mean, from very big software providers, and I remember the Epic Enterprise Patient Record System, they couldn't handle FMD when I was doing the UK. But then other ones, smaller ones, are much more effective. A lot of the particularly the smaller vendors may have less capability in doing the development work and creating and working with these standards. As you have indicated, they use things like hard coding, which means they can't handle variability in the data sets that are being transmitted.
Yeah, correctly.
Yeah, and that is a challenge in some respects for the people who are the customers. Maybe there's also, I don't know how it works in the USA, but in Europe there are trade associations, and you can work through the trade associations to get some of that knowledge disseminated across multiple providers.
Yes,
So if you've got a constituency like community pharmacy or wholesale distribution and those sorts of things, I mean, big companies like McKesson in the UK, in the US, they would be a big company. They would be able to disseminate across all their sites. But if you've got a medium or a small one, you may need to use a trade association to help disseminate that information and how to manage it, how to manage your vendor. Yeah? One of the things I've been talking with Envo recently is about what should you do? How should you select a software vendor? What are the things you should be looking for, and what are the do's and don'ts that you should look out for? Because it's still a problem. It's a problem when you start getting different digital vendors together. You will have different skills and capabilities. That's just the nature of where we are. Yeah?
The major difference, if you look in the US versus Europe, is that for the US, the onboarding is very important because every business partner needs to be connected with every other business partner. For the very simple reason that the US has chosen a model where there is no central body.
Yeah, that's correct.
The difference, of course, in Europe is that we have a central body. We have a European hub for the OBPs, the MEHs, and the parallel importers. And for the wholesalers and the dispensers, we have the national systems. So it's a lot easier that if I'm a small, like you just said, like a small software vendor, my only interface is actually to that national system or to that European hub. And especially to the national system, you see an enormous amount of small companies that have built an app. And that is, I think, the biggest issue in the US, why the vendors are so limited, is because everybody needs to talk to everybody. And it's a very complex process. So if you don't lock yourself kind of in the inner circle and know your competitors and build up a relationship with your competitors, you're simply out.
There is similar situation in Europe, not exactly the same, but I could say Italy, it's a good example at the moment because they are at the moment connecting to ENVO system. They had some year postponing. And at the moment, what we see as a vendor here with Italy is that there are a lot of companies there, quite a lot, which they have their own small solution for management of the production inside. And like you said, Mark, the only connection is to the ENVO, but they also try to outsource their capabilities, for example, to produce batches for other company. And when they try to connect their own solutions, we see the problem with the communication at that time, because every small company make their own connection, and after that they claim that they are working by standards and connecting to the ENVO, and when they try to connect one company with another, everyone see that they differently interpret this standard, and they build different solution. It's not similar to US. The similarity comes not with the connection between the connection between companies that are marketing authorization holders and CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations, someone that produce the batches for them. So the same issue that you have in USA could be visualized when we are speaking about this connection between partners.
But the only difference, of course, that when you talk about CMO MEH,
Exactly.
there is actually there is no standard.
That everyone claimed that there is a standard, because I'm from the side of the company that are providing software for connecting such companies, and on daily basis I connect with people who claim that they are following just one standard or some standard with the APS communication, API communication, and okay, maybe we are with different standard, but sometimes there is difference in the messages. I see it at least one per week per connection, quite often.
And what's, and I'll just jump in and say, and what is the single greatest thing missing that would truly allow us as an industry to not just say or claim we're using a standard, but actually commit to that and see that in practice? And the thing that's missing is, again, and we can talk at least in the US, is any semblance of enforcement of that standard, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
for 15 plus years, I've been saying, how nice would it be if there could be a concept of like the GS1 police, right? Somebody who was actually paying attention and watching over to see if, implementations were using their standards correctly. That doesn't exist, right? Now that would never exist as truly GS1 police, but there are plenty of opportunities which the industry has not taken to leverage concepts or frameworks that would introduce a level of enforcement, right? So if you don't send a truly valid EPCIS file per the schema, per industry guidance, whatever, however strict you want to kind of set that level of enforcement, that message isn't going to get to its destination, right? I mean, we absolutely can do that from a technical standpoint. The industry has chosen not to adopt it, and quite honestly went, I would say, even the other direction, which is, again, in the early days of creating and establishing all these connections, when these sort of two things, either when these varieties of EPCIS started popping up, or even worse, right, when you had sort of requirements or needs to connect, not even using EPCIS, right, using completely other formats. The problem is, and I can happily say it's none of the vendors on the call here today, but I'll say sort of the legacy vendors, if you will, accepted it. They allowed, those varieties to be acceptable. They allowed the non-standard formats to be acceptable. I think back to the point that Mark was making earlier, right? Because if you didn't sort of build and accept those varieties and even non-standard formats 10, 15 years ago, you literally wouldn't have a business at that point, right? And so the challenge is the precedent was set so long ago to allow all of these, what effectively come down to, non-compliant formats and varieties that are sort of non-compliant with the EPCIS standard. Those were accepted by the vendors so long ago that nowadays they're just commonplace. And so now, as folks who are on this call, right, vendors who are on this call, who all sort of say are sort of, let's call it the next generation or the next evolution of vendors, right? You guys come in and say, well, this is crazy. You're trying to send me something that I can tell you and show you with very clear evidence is clearly not following the standard. The problem is, most likely, in many cases, that vendor who's trying to send you that file or maybe asking you to send a file in a certain way is going to say, hey, look, I've been doing this for 10, 15 years. So if you don't want to do it, my customers, know that I've been doing it for so long. That creates a business challenge. So something needs to come into play, I think, to completely change the mindset to where it doesn't even become a negotiable thing anymore, right? You wouldn't even have the opportunity to have conversations because there needs to be something at the more technical level that is really introducing that level of enforcement of, is this truly, a standard EPCIS message? If it is, great, I'll let it go to where it needs to go. If it's not, it simply will not be communicated, on this network or whatever that technical component is. That's a massive mind shift, as we all know, for the industry. But I think that's probably the only realistic way we get to a true level of enforcement of these standards in this space.
So what you're saying, Scott, is basically you need to have some governance over the way that data is interchanged. And that can either be at an industry level. We have GS1, which is a standards body, but it doesn't enforce the standards. Or you can have the regulators can regulate the IT industry or the digital technologies industry, whatever you want to call it, which traditionally they've not done, and they didn't do it in Europe, and they certainly haven't done it in the USA. Well, you're going to have to think of another way. I mean, there are other examples of where industry has come together. The airline industry and the airports industry and the oil and gas companies have come together. They have the International Air Transport Association, which is effectively their inter-industry body, and they have brought together standards that everyone meets, so that when they're filling up planes and they're moving information around about invoicing and fulfillment and fueling, they have common data interchange standards that everyone adheres to. And if you don't follow the standard, you can't be part of the industry. So the question is, why can't that happen in the pharma industry, the life sciences?
And I think it's an unfortunate answer, right? Of, it's not that it can't happen, it hasn't, and I think there's so much commercial interest to almost make sure it doesn't happen at this point. Because let's look at it the other way. If tomorrow I could snap my fingers and immediately introduce, however, in some way, shape, or form, introduce a level of enforcement, meaning magically every EPCIS exchange, from packaging sites to manufacturers to distribution sites to between trading partners, obviously I'm talking a very US scenario here, but if I can magically, introduce a level of enforcement of all of those EPCIS exchanges, or not even, let me just say, of all those data exchanges that are happening, and if any of them didn't comply with EPCIS or weren't even EPCIS to start, right, they failed. If I snap my fingers and that happened tomorrow, what percentage of data exchanges would immediately start failing? It's a significantly higher number than probably most people think. Most people might think, oh, okay, maybe there's 5 or 10% of data exchanges would start failing if you could magically start enforcing it tomorrow. I'd put it closer to a 30, 40, even higher kind of range if you truly and strictly were enforcing, the use of proper EPCIS, or even checking if EPCIS was the standard being used. I think it's a massive number of data exchanges that would start failing right away. And that's the problem. That's become the norm in the industry.
Okay, so is it possible? Can I ask a question? You go, Abraham, you go ahead, because I've spoken.
Sorry, yeah, I think, Scott, in a good way, there are early signs that a regulatory intervention is happening, um, especially with the US Drug Supply Chain Security Act. The distributors are now being subjected to their EPCIS file audits, in which, if there is any discrepancy found, maybe format error or anything, right, there's a direct implication in the distributor's scorecard, and it also the distributor is also liable to get an FDA observation, so as to speak. Now, as a person, I follow first principles very strictly, right? And even in Altius Hub with my customers in the industry, I think all of us gentlemen can agree that the major root cause is not that there is EPCS 1.0 or 1.2 or 2.0. The major the biggest problem statement is there is EPCIS and then there is a proprietary format. This disrupts the complete network data exchange, right? And like I highlighted, right? I think Nikolai was talking about how the data exchanges from a CMO to an MAH. Uh, Let me also give you some ground reality that it is even more crazy out there. Why? Because Uh, let's assume there is a large CMO manufacturing for five different brand owners sitting out of maybe US and Europe and scattered across. And this large CMO, maybe a multi-billion dollar pharma conglomerate, is not only using a traceability system, but it is loaning its own traceability system to multiple other subcontract manufacturers within the region. Why? Because to meet the production capability. Now, what does that mean? They are subcontracting their own serial numbers, giving it to them, saying that I have to meet the manufacturing demand of so and so brand owners. So why don't you, on my behalf, manufacture this, ship it to my location? I eventually ship it back to them. Now imagine the complexity of data exchange. Serial numbers goes from that major multi-billion dollar CMO to that small time $1 million revenue earning CMO. They manufacture it. They ensure that a EPCIS file is generated, whether it is 1.0, whether it is 2.0, 1.2, we don't know. Is it in proprietary format? We don't know. That person sends that shipment file to the major manufacturer, and then this major manufacturer eventually sends that data to the downstream partners and eventually to the distributors. Now imagine the chain effect. Distributors have now started penalizing CMOs, saying that FDAs are scrutinizing my EPCIS. If there is an issue, I'll be getting an observation. So I'm going to ensure that whatever you share it with me is right. Now, this is where things get murkier. There are proprietary formats coming into play because things would have been easier. Because I think Dan and Scott would know this better, that file conversion from 1.0 to 1.2 or 1.0 to 2.0, it's not a big hurdle. It's not right, a big shift. It can be done. But completely changing it to a proprietary format, managing that data, and then reintroducing them into a 1.0 or 2.0, that's where the problem lies, right? Now, we discussed a lot of problem statement, and I think a lot of in our conversation an elegant solution also came up. Mark and Jeremy were talking about feedback loops, and trust me, this is one solution that I've given to my customer. In the interest of this community, I'm happy to share this with you as well. What the customers are willing to accept is fine. I have other third party upstream and downstream partners. All of them are using their own L4 system. I can't change their business decisions. Whatever I choose to have in my shop floor, in my business entity, I will use that L4. So, how will I ensure that my partners are generating the right format? I introduced an approval flow. Very elegant solution. Why? Because serialization experts are an endangered species in the industry. There are not really many serialization traceability experts in the industry. So there are very few. Most likely in every organization there can be one, and in smaller organization they loan this expertise from somewhere else. So I said, fine, I'll give you an approval flow. Let your upstream partners generate the file and do a quick feedback loop, like Mark and Jeremy are saying. Quick approval check. Is it fine? Yes, no. If no, what's wrong? Quick correction. The technology allows for it. There is direct configuration, direct ability to correct that file. If it is yes, then fine. File moves on. And then the same thing, the approval flow from their downstream partner, the MAHS brand owners. If they say approve, yeah, the distributor says the file looks great, send it to me. I'm good. It's as simple as that. What we are addressing here, see, we all have built great products, we all have built great technologies. What really is moving the needle is uh, fine tuning where the accountability lies, fine tuning where the accountability of precision of this file lies. Right now, it is with vendor and service teams. Everyone is dependent on them. The service team will ensure that your file is accurate or not accurate. The moment to shift that accountability, one on the product and one at a centralized, uh, you know, uh, an SME, things starts moving, and this approval flow is working out. a lot of customers of mine are now saying that can we have these approval flows established to multiple other partners, because I have the large customer says that I have the serialization expertise. I want my partners to give me the right file. I just want the ability to check whether it's coming in the right format, in the with the right constituent, with the right content or not. And this is where we are eliminating proprietary format, throwing it out of the window and saying that we will do it. It's just that please follow EPCIS model, because that is the global standards. The GS1 bodies, the US GS1 guidelines, all of them have solved this problem, right? They have introduced this global standards. They have introduced for everyone across the world to use your GLNs, your G10, your N10s, and whatnot, and adhere to an XML format. Guess who is not adhering to that XML format, EPCS format? The legacy one. And that's where this entire chaos is emerging from.
Hey, you call out a really good point. I think circling back on a few things that have been said, enforcement and governance are paragon to success, right? We have laws and they're governed. I think Scott's use of GS1 policemen is fantastic. Whether it's GS1 that does the policing or it's a combination of a community of customers and regulating authorities, that's certainly the correct step. But you can look at Bahrain and you can look at Arabia as examples of two countries that have serialization, and there is a smaller populace in those countries, but they're able to affect enforcement and governance to a very, very high standard of performance and interoperability, right?
And that works with small countries, Justin. And you
Right.
you see it working in the very small countries. In the bigger countries, the governance, particularly at the national level, is much more fragmented, and so therefore it's much harder to make it work consistently.
Right, but that's just maturity. That, in my opinion, is just that it's a level of maturity in terms of understanding. Just because Europe haven't been able to achieve that in 7 years, but Arabia have in a year, isn't because they've got a smaller population. It's because they've enforced.
It's because the regulator.
It's because of enforcement. They've simply said,
exactly.
You guys aren't performing well, and you watch everyone start performing well. In Europe, they're too afraid to say that. Right?
No,
I'm not gonna no, for sure. But I'm not gonna suggest that we should be like, pulling out the whip and flogging people in Europe for not conforming, right? But we have laws, and laws are enforced, right? And it just happens to be that in serialization, there's zero enforcement in many regions. You have the laws, but not the enforcement. And I'm just saying that the two have to go together. Now, let's come back to the point that Abby raised, and is kind of the theme of this, right? Is the interoperability. EPCIS, right, is the standard for supply chain, and anyone can argue till the cows come home there's an alternative, but the agreed standard, and for any given reason in which you need to use that supply chain traceability and serialization conceptual framework, EPCIS is perfectly ideal and nothing comes close to it, right? So if you have this understanding, right, as a basic level understanding as a customer, right? And then you're going to say, well, this is my reference. It's English. This is the international language of business. English. We're going to use this. And then I start to cooperate with people who start speaking Arabic, right? Now, Arabic's a great example because it's one of the languages you can translate from English to Arabic and back to English, and it won't be the original, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that if you have an EPCIS standard-based supply chain, and you interact with partners that support EPCIS, but fundamentally use their own formats like TraceLink's TLXML, it's not unreasonable for me to say that those systems in the supply chain are adulterating EPCIS data, right? Now, anyone's free to make whatever decision they want to with that knowledge. If they want to continue engaging with parties that don't conform to that standard, and you understand there's a risk to your data as it moves into their proprietary supply chain framework, that's your prerogative. But ignoring the fact that you could eliminate that risk by insisting that your partners adopt a standards-based technology is not unreasonable. You know, it's written into technical agreements already. So I understand what you're saying, Jerome. Maybe I'm a bit of a hardliner when it comes to these things, but I don't think there's any excuse for a lack of enforcement, right? And we all have a responsibility. Sorry, Mark.
Even if you look at the US, we don't, I mean, there is no police. I don't think there is anybody like the HTA or the GS1 that is going to take the responsibility to enforce it. But I mean, there are organizations like Gateway Checker, for example, in the US, that do provide a testing program supported by GS1, in which you can, as a supplier, have all your files being tested. So you say, okay, this is the set of files that are required for a manufacturer. These are the set of files required as a distributor. And I like my system to be certified that my messages are 100% conform to the CSA standard. That only works for the US, of course, but there is an advantage of doing those type of things because, at least in our situation, we have that certification, and at least it kind of stops the discussion when you talk with another partner that says we don't accept your files because, to our opinion, they're not the CSA compliant. And at least now we can say, well, we don't really care so much about your opinion. I mean, we have a
But
statement.
it goes further than that, then, Mark. I mean, Nikolai has horror stories where a customer had to revert from onboarding a partner because that proprietary network partner insisted on costs to their customer that they wanted to pass on in order to not use their platform.
To make reconfiguration of their internal system, which reconfiguration basically means change of passwords and URL, nothing else. If to move forward with this discussion about the configuration, whatever, between partners, and also with what is the correct EPA's file format, in the end of the day, who takes the risk the risk of if the system is not working? Either it shouldn't be the company that it's providing the software. Usually it's never the company that providing the software, but the partner that wants something to be serialized for them. So here implementation of chasing the software providers to be compliant with already established certificate or system, it's good point, because otherwise the end user are the one that take the risk. If I manage to explain my point here.
Yes.
The wholesalers, the pharmacies, etc.
Yeah, because
they're
I can
obliged
say
to comply with regulation, aren't they?
Yeah, I can say like yeah, like Mark said, I can say that we are not going to use this file format or whatever because they are not the correct one. But if I do that as a company that choose to take our solution, means that they, in the end of the day, they will not have the required connection. And who is taking the risk in this case? And what to do? I have a contract with them that I will do anything it's possible in my hands to make the connection. In that case, I don't want to make this modification, but I'm by contract obligated to do it with the wrong file format.
Yeah, and it has to do with
And
scale.
So that
Bigger or
creates
smaller
complexity
company.
and cost for you, doesn't it? Each time you manage that. Complexity,
That's the
cost, and
culture,
effort to
though,
do that.
unfortunately. That's the
That's
culture.
complexity, cost and effort. But ultimately, it was the person who's obliged to comply with the regulation that has to keep the records. They're going to be inspected by the regulator. The challenge, and you see this in Europe, the challenge is that the regulators don't know how to inspect them for compliance with the regulation. So particularly they do it when you're dealing with GMP and when you're dealing with GDP. But when you're down at the hospital or the pharmacist or the hospital or the pharmacist, they just don't know how to do it. So it just doesn't get done. So the main area where you perhaps need to focus is it GMP compliance? Because they do get inspected. Even I think CMOs get inspected for GMP. And I remember the EMA used to ask the UK regulator to do a lot of the inspections in India and China. They don't do it anymore, obviously, because of Brexit, but they did make sure that a lot of the suppliers in those regions were compliant with the standards, and they kept the correct records.
I think there's a level of capability, maturity that needs to be kind of standardized across people's understanding. I mean, GMP serves a purpose, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't identify or red flag some of the issues in the supply chain. Because it obviously overlooks these big gaps. So I still think that when you look at the fact that you need to exchange data and the data is your commodity, right? Having that level of maturity and understanding what I'm doing with my data and how it's moving through the supply chain is something that doesn't really become the responsibility or in the control of regulators, as it does more so in the customer's hands, because it's their data, right? They're either the direct benefactor or the person who loses out from its integrity being compromised. So I think this is just about education. And, as Scott described, the new generation of vendors are you guys, right, who are able to provide these more modern solutions that can be referenced so that people can see, well, okay, I'm using this software. Why do I need to change? My partners are using this software. I mean, we recently have just migrated a customer, a near on billion euro a year pharma company from a legacy vendor, right? And they've successfully taken close on to 100 managed connections that were a combination of all sorts of different formats, right? Yeah, various formats. And someone said that was a standard. You got a configuration document for that standard. And these guys have got their standard. They've got their standard. But when you examine them, they're all very, very different. And what this customer has now realized and done is they've actually standardized their entire communication to be EPCIS with every single one of their partners by saying, I'm going to operate a level 5 network that's pure EPCIS. If you want to use TraceLink XML, you want to use Strawberry Hubba Bubba, you can do whatever it is you want to, right? As long as you send me back and receive conformant data from my network, right? And the shift from managing not just almost 100 connections, but all the gubbins and the complexity and the documentation and the configuration and resource dependency and all sorts of silly, unnecessary, archaic, draconian technologies to something that's so simple and so straightforward that all you need is a dashboard to do everything, right? And that's not a dream, that's happening today, right? It's just a level of awareness. Yeah, it's just a level of understanding and familiarity. And one of the reasons why Scott, Jerome, and I get you guys together is because we want to demonstrate that we work together. Completely different, objectives. We have completely different solutions, right? But they're all achieving the same thing for the customer, and they all work together, right? That's a strong message to send, right? But if you've got an environment where you don't have that assurance and you're aligned to a brand or a vendor, but not how your data moves along the supply chain, then in my opinion, that's a level of immaturity, right? And it's not of anyone's fault, because I didn't understand about serialization. I ironically learned about serialization from TraceLink, right? And it took me a long time to realize that most of it was rubbish. But I'm able to have a conversation now, logically, scientifically, and in terms of business, why certain decisions need to be understood and reviewed. And there's enough data there now for people to have those conversations. And I think that's the great thing about this show. We're at that point, that milestone, if you will. And I very much think that this year is going to be a significant year for serialization for everyone, where we've been able to demonstrate that you can move away from these extremely complicated and costly serialization infrastructure models to what is akin to the internet, significantly cheaper, significantly easier to manage. And more importantly, the data that you own is transparent and of value, where there's a clear return on investment in sight, right? Which is something that serialization and compliance has never had, right, historically. So maybe I'm being too much of an optimist with that view, but I do think that this is about educating people and providing them. And guys, you should show off your systems. You should show people how easy it is to connect. You should show how easy it is to connect to multiple compliance networks. I know all of you guys make it really easy to connect to new markets and very cheap. One of the key things you'll hear from anyone when they connect to a new market, tens of thousands, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 to connect to a new market. Ridiculous. Ludicrous. Right? Mel Brooks, ludicrous. Right? So, you know, and I know where you're coming from, Jerome, and I understand that there are due processes, there is bureaucracy and so forth, right? But I think that the real power, the shift, comes from the customers, because it's the customers who really dictate the direction that the industry moves in, not the vendors. The vendors can woo us this way, and they can, trick us that way, right? But it's the customers who need to have that level of maturity and understanding, this is my requirement, this is what I expect from my supplier. And I think that in Europe, there's some way to go, and maybe in the US, it's moving a little bit faster because of that traceability concept. But certainly in Africa, I'm seeing a lot more forward thinking, a lot more, let's just get this straight now, right? Let's just make sure that we place in governance and we place in enforcement from the beginning, right? And that's another argument entirely. But I do think the customers are the ones with the power to educate, learn. Don't be afraid to go to any of these guys, Mark, Dan, Nikolai, Abby, and even leverage them to negotiate your contract, but be open-minded. Have a look at what there is out there, because the way serialization is done right now is so backwards. It's so pre-World War. And there's a lot of technology out there that can make a big difference. Sorry, bit of a rant.
Yeah, I think you raised an important point there. That if it's customer driven, the customer can set the standard, because they're the one that's buying ultimately, and they're the one that's paying. So if they're paying, they can set the standard. But it takes an envisioned customer to be able to drive through that sort of change, to standardize all their connections around one standard.
I think there's a business acumen that shouldn't be overlooked, though, as well, Jerome.
Mm.
And I think that some of us have had the wool pulled over our eyes,
Mm.
right? Because we haven't been fully, we talk about compliance panic and the conflation of data with the system.
Yeah.
So I think that has been a problem. And there's also been the network effect where a specific vendor was able to convince a large part of the industry that they were the choice. But in fact, they're the ones who are non-conformant to standards in terms of they use a proprietary format, they use a proprietary network, they're resource dependent, and their name is TraceLink. And I'm not ashamed to say that, right? Because it's a fact. So that is a legacy vendor, in my opinion. And I have to make that head-on statement because there's no point doing what we do if we're not going to
I think
do
that
what we believe in.
Mark raised an important point, though. Mark raised a point, right, the point that there are groups that do compliance checking, and if you can have your connectivity certified against that compliance checker and show that you're a certified solution, that similarly Nikolai and Dan and Abby, then effectively you've got a common standard, haven't you?
Only if that standard is common by the groups of which, because the thing is, Scott and I could go and make a standard, right? You could go and make a standard, right? It's the entire community has to agree upon that standard. So while we might have those standards, it would need to include GS1, it would need to include we would have to have a recognized, reputable group of members who are direct benefactors as in terms of the customers of those standards. And I think there's a lot more to it than just saying that I've received the data in a conformant format. I think there's you have QPs, for example, that rarely log into a serialization system. You have pharmacovigilance, which is just beginning to recognize and mature into understanding the relevance of serialization data. So there's a business acumen attached to how people make decisions. And when you're dealing with data, you have to have a level of acumen to understand what the benefits to my business of that with that data. And that's something where the maturity, I think, is to be, there's an air this is where we need to grow. In my view, sorry. Scott, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think my kind of closing thoughts, just to summarize a lot of the different conversations we've had. It's first and foremost that this has never been a technology problem, right? It's sort of all the other factors that have come into play. But I think and maybe in a strange way, that's also the reason for kind of optimism. Because again, I think the folks on this call are certainly marching towards the much better models than what we've seen, from a legacy standpoint. I think there is, challenges still in how that gets conveyed to the industry. I've been pretty outspoken. I'm not. I think the industry groups of all shapes and sizes have benefit in terms of, it's still something that's pulling people together. But I'm a firm believer that really the only way to kind of enact a true evolution in how pharmaceuticalization operates is to just quite honestly go build it and then show, to your point, Justin, show the business benefit and really ground it in how these sort of newer approaches, newer concepts, newer models are so significantly better from a purely business standpoint, right? You got to translate everything into dollars and cents, right? That's what'll get customers' attention more so than trying to sort of play nice in the industry groups. You gotta participate in those industry groups, right? But I'm not holding my breath that they're going to be the source of kind of true evolution in this space. So yeah, I think it's leveraging technology. We've made references to, I think, how a lot of the just the basics of better interoperability is, model it after the internet. If I need to go to a website, I just need to know the URL. And whether I can get into that website is a different discussion, but I can get to that website without any sort of outside help. I have the tools, I have the information I need, I can make my request, and I can, get to the front door. And I think that's what we need to try and get interoperability in the serialization space too, right? Is I as long as I have the basic information, who do I need to send this data to? I should be able to get that data to their front door without the help of literally a single other person, being involved. So I think it's a lot about just sort of going back to basics. And I think it's building, the next evolution of technology that just kind of focuses on those basics is what we're going to hopefully see be the real catalyst for change in how we think about interoperability in the space.
I quite like the idea, just in that set, for enforcement of some regulation, because while I was listening, I just remember something very interesting with the European verification system. In the beginning, when was implemented, everyone knows that the requirement for serialization is to be random with the necessary randomization between the numbers. And when it was introduced in Europe, many messages didn't reach out to ENVIO because the calculation about the serial number randomization was wrong. And many messages were stopped and batches were not sent and respectively go to the market. And this checkup was later switched off from the ENVIO, and at the moment the requirement from the European system is to have the randomization, but no one prevents you to report serial numbers without the necessary randomization. So we have something. Just remember about this, that we have the requirement, but it's not forward. So how to enforce some requirements? We need somehow to enforce these requirements. So I'm quite keen to the idea of enforcement, some method. Of course, Mark explained it for US. There are some possibility to check your data, your messages that is correct. And if you check it and confirm, okay, my company make correct messages, everything will be perfect. And at least maybe not repercussion to the other companies, but somehow to say everyone who is the company that it's really following the requirements and who not, because this way maybe the end customer will be able to think and to enforce their choice to the software providers. What do you think?
Jerome?
With this.
I remember the insufficient randomization alerts very early that kept propping up, but
now it pop up with exclamation mark, but it's not stopping the message.
Yeah, I think that's one for Jerome.
Yes, I think they did stop. I think when it started up, because there was a big ramp up. I remember the ramp up going very rapidly, and I think having lots of people having messages stopped created too much friction in the supply chain, and too much friction, particularly during that learning phase. And so they switched it off. But whether they ever switched it back on again, I don't know.
No, it's not. It's not on. I know.
Switched back on. I know it was there because I remember having to manage it when I worked at GSK. So. Yeah.
Mm. So we have the rule, but no one is following.
Well, that's the challenge. Is if the rule goes in and it's too stringent to start with, particularly in a learning phase, when you're learning and getting up and running, it can create more problems than it solves. And so therefore, but then you have to say, well, how do you switch it back on? And if you look at the way that they did it in Europe, many countries implemented what they called a soft launch. And they went on, and some of them are only just coming out of their soft launch now, 6 or 7 years after they started, because it took such a long time to get everyone up to a level of maturity where they could actually do things consistently, that then that they had to let it last that long. So it can, you can put in too stringent compliance. The challenge now is that, particularly with DSE CSA, as far as I can see it, having a distributed system with very little governance, or having it managed at state level, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, but at the state level, it'll be inconsistent in just the same way the governance or an oversight that it is at the European level, that is inconsistently applied depending on where you're sitting. And so therefore, what you'll see is you'll see it be the rollout will be inconsistent in different places. And that's what you see in the EMPS as well.
I mean, certainly what we have not even reached this point in the US, whether it's at the state level or federal level, right? But where it does tie into interoperability is that the ability for whoever the agency is, again, if it's state level or federal level, the ability for them to truly leverage data about the full history of an item is going to be very eye-opening when they get past the first layer, which is, oh, I have a standardized, DSCSA T2 message. That's great. But if those agencies ever have any interest or motivation to go back to, I want to see, data down to the packaging operations or the distribution operations, right? That's where they're going to start to encounter either a whole variety of, data exchange formats, including many that are not standard at all. And so again, just the feasibility to think that, again, the FDA or even a state agency in the US could have this magical tool that's going to be able to actually, visualize the full history of an item back to its packaging operations is a complete pipe dream. Because again, they're going to find that so much of that data beyond the T2 is not standard EPCIS or not even in the EPCIS format at all. That's where challenges, I think, are still very much ahead for actually
and you
leveraging
think about
trace.
the federal regulator, if you think about the state level regulators, they probably, and then this comes down to the large versus small sort of country model as well, Justin. Where you've got the larger ones, you tend to get the people in them tend to move around between roles more frequently, and so therefore you don't have the same level of skill. You can't retain the skills. So even if you get somebody who understands it, they're not going to stick there for long. So you get no stickability in terms of the application of enforcement. Yeah. So I think you're going to find that the enforcement's going to be very patchy for quite a long time to come in the USA until there are some common standards put in place.